Hello, I'm Dr. Winston York. I'm a software engineer, but I'm also very interested in voting systems. This fall, my province of British Columbia is holding a referendum on whether or not to adopt proportional representation as our voting system in the place of first past the post. I'm making a series of videos to help voters, particularly conservative voters like myself, make an informed decision about how to vote in this important referendum. An argument made by many on the conservative side of the political spectrum is that proportional representation will increase the size of the government. And as someone who believes the government should be smaller, not larger, this is something I take very seriously. The logic is that under a proportional system, small parties manage to get policies and programs implemented that increase government spending in return for their support of the governing parties. And it's certainly not that this doesn't happen, but I think it's something that's already happening under first past the post. Remember, all political parties are coalitions. We have coalitions both under first past the post and proportional representation. The parties that are able to get programs implemented that they want are simply factions within political parties in our current system. This isn't a huge dramatic change. This is something that already goes on, and it's an inherent issue that happens with democracy. Democracies end up involving coalitions of people, and these coalitions will implement policies favoring different elements of that coalition in order to gain their support. However, what makes this argument more interesting is it's an empirical argument. People will actually argue that if you look at countries with proportional representation, they tend to have larger governments. The most common source for this is a report from the Fraser Institute entitled Electoral Rules and Fiscal Policy Outcomes. Here we have a crucial figure from that report. What you see on the left is a group of proportional countries, and they have an average government spending as a percentage of GDP of 29%, whereas on the right you have the first past the post or majoritarian countries, and they have an average government spending as a percentage of GDP as 24%. And the argument essentially is, look, the proportional representation countries spend 5% more of GDP on government than do the first past the post or majoritarian countries. The majoritarian countries are Australia and France, and they differ from our current system in that the candidate who wins a riding is required to have a majority support in that riding, unlike our system where a candidate can be the representative of a riding even though a majority of the people in that riding voted against them. The biggest problem with this graph is that it's looking at central government spending and not overall government spending. This means that many of those countries leftmost in the graph that have the highest degree of central government spending do not actually have particularly high overall government spending. It's simply that they lack the equivalent of a provincial government. So spending that would take place in provincial governments in other systems simply takes place at the central level there, making the comparison basically meaningless. As another case, France here appears to have a mid-range sized government, but in fact, France has 4 levels of government, and if you include all the levels of government, it has one of the largest governments of all these countries being compared. Alternately, here's a chart I prepared of the OECD countries, and I based the government spending on the Heritage Foundation's information about overall government spending as a percentage of GDP. And you can see it looks quite different. The countries are in completely different places. I've colored systems which are non-proportional, the first past the post and majoritarian systems in red, and I've colored strictly proportional systems in green. Some systems have some degree of mixing in them, and I've colored those ones blue. What you see here is that the relationship that seemed to exist previously between the electoral system and the size of government has largely disappeared. It seems to have been an artifact of comparing the wrong data. Fundamentally, I find this kind of study dubious. I think it's very difficult to draw useful conclusions from this empirical comparison of countries. For one, there are only 3 OECD countries which use first past the post, which means that you're either looking at a really small sample of first past the post countries, or you're comparing it to countries in a very different state of economic development, and both of those would make it very difficult to draw any good conclusions. I think what the data does suggest is that other factors are really much more important in determining what kind of government you have than your voting system. In fact, the most important factor in determining what kind of a government you have is, are you a former British colony? The former British colonies, which inherited the British political tradition, all have relatively similar sizes of government, and that's much more important than what particular electoral system they're using. At the end of the day, it's got to come down to the voters. And if voters want bigger government, they're going to vote for bigger government parties, and that's going to produce bigger government. And if voters want smaller government, they have to vote for smaller government parties, and then we'll have smaller governments. At the end of the day, it has to be up to the voters to make those decisions, and the electoral system isn't going to make the decision for them. And so I don't think first past the post or proportional representation are either fundamentally either more pro-big government or pro-small government. They're simply reflecting how people in those systems are going to vote.